tries to destroy my orchard, I bankrupt her and get her house torn down. Welcome to Reddit Chronicles. Here are today's stories. And if you liked the video, do consider subscribing to help me feed my channel and grow my cat. Sorry, might be a bit long. TLDR at the bottom. Well, let's start a few years in the past. My great-grandparents planted an orchard. It is now at least 120 years old. My grandparents and my parents were really proud of the peach trees growing in it, and did their best to keep them in good health and well. We always threw a big party when the peaches were ready to be harvested, and invited all of our friends and neighbors to it. I loved those parties. The neighbors on this property to the south of our orchard were particularly fond of our peaches. They were a bunch of fine old people, and me and the old man, Sam, were pretty good friends. He taught me a lot about woodworking with hand tools only, and we had some great evenings in his workshop, and we finished many a good whiskeys in there together. In return, he got a lot of fine peaches, marmalade, homemade peach liquor, etc. Sadly, he died a good 10 years ago. Cancer is a real. His wife followed soon after. Many suspected it was of a broken heart. They had no kids, so all of their property was left to the state, except his tools and whiskey collection, which he had gifted me a few weeks before he died. In comes Karen. That name speaks for itself. Haircut, attitude, the whole deal. She bought the property of my late neighbors. We hadn't had the kind of money to buy it at that time, as we'd met some dire straits the years before, and all our savings were gone. The first thing she did, before she actually moved in, was to go around making demands of the neighbors on the surrounding properties. When it was finally our turn to listen to her gibberish, she told us that we needed to remove half of the trees, as the leaves were blowing on her property. We told her in a polite way that we won't comply with her demands, as the orchard is a vital part of our family heritage/tradition/life, and has been there for at least 120 years. She was pretty pissed, but did nothing for the time being. There are some things you need to know before I continue with the story. The workshop I mentioned before was situated right at the border of our property. It was a small timber-framed building, at least 160 to 180 years old. The regulations in my state are pretty strict concerning old structures. Every structure over 100 years is protected, and you need a special permission to tear it down. Failing to get this permission can lead to a hefty fine. To get the permission to build a new building, it has to be up to code, and you have to ask your surrounding neighbors, and if they agree, you're good to go. Except there is one specialty in my country. You have to keep a certain distance to the border of the property to allow emergency services full access to your property. If one of these requirements isn't met, the building is illegal, or at least only partially legal, and can be actually ordered by court to be torn down. That might come in handy later. So, back to Karen. After our first encounter with her, she did her best to pester the whole neighborhood. She got the neighbor's dog put down because he allegedly attacked her brat. It later turned out she faked the attack. The dog was the sweetest and most innocent dog you could imagine. A Bernese mountain dog, big but a real teddy bear. Anyways, she later got us to stop doing our annual peach parties, as she called the police every time for various reasons. Noise complaints, we had a band playing there in the afternoon. Arson, we lit a fire in a designated fire pit in the middle of our property. She called the ATF on us, allegedly making moonshine. My dad had a license to distill for our own consumption. In short, she was a real pain in the bum-bum, and after 3 years, we decided it wasn't worth it to deal with various officers and law enforcement agencies every time we threw the party, and we decided to quit. After she had reached this goal, she resorted to pestering us to remove the orchard. We didn't cave in, and some things started to get really fishy. Somehow, the tires of our trucks got slashed, eggs got thrown on our farmhouse, our cat disappeared and surfaced a few days later in pretty rough condition. It looked like somebody had tried to cut his tail off. Don't worry, he healed up completely, but we actually couldn't prove that she did all that. Then came the day she made her biggest mistake. She had a company come in a sort of secret operation and tear down the old woodworking workshop overnight. 2 days later, they started building a big garage/recreational center/house right where the shop was, but she missed one fine detail, which got pretty important later on. She didn't ask for our permission, nor for the neighbors. A short while later, the trees right next to her property started to get sick. The leaves turned brown in the middle of summer, and the branches started to die. We lost 4 trees before we figured out the cause. Somebody had driven long copper nails into them. We had a suspicion, but we couldn't prove it. So we put up some trail cameras, perfectly legal, as it was on our own property. We caught her red-handed. My dad confronted her. She apologized, and my dad, being the way too nice guy he is, wanted to let her get off the hook. But not me. The nail she drove into our oldest tree was the final nail to her coffin. I started to investigate. I had some friends at the administration of our county and asked them to do some inquiries. Turned out, she hasn't applied for permission to tear down the old shop, nor for permission to build a new building. I further did some inquiries on the borderline of our property. Turned out, the old markers vanished over time, and her building was about 3 feet on our property. After I had gathered all this information, I presented it to my parents. At first, they were reluctant, as they didn't want to start a neighborhood clash. But after I recalled all the things she did to us and our neighbors, they were in. So let the games begin. First, we called the authorities on her for tearing down a protected building and presented them with all the evidence we gathered. Then, we called the building authorities on her for building a building without permission, not up to code. And not only didn't she keep the required distance to the property's border, she also built on our property without our permission. Long story short, turned out the workshop hasn't only been protected because of its age, but also because it was a historical landmark, which played a vital role in a conflict back in the 1860s. She got sued for this and had to pay a fine of an equivalent of about $150,000. She further had to demolish her newly built building, costing an additional $50,000, and got fined for this too, about $83,000, and had to rebuild the workshop on her own expense, which was another whopping $154,000, as it had to be period correct up to the smallest detail. Means it had to be built with the correct materials, with hand tools only, and to the correct dimensions. As you can imagine, paying professionals to build quite a large timber-framed building, only by hand, gets pretty expensive, pretty fast. So all in all, it cost her an equivalent of $437,000, plus further expenses as lawyers, etc. This caused her to go bankrupt, so she had to sell the property in the end, which my parents bought, by the way. Last I heard of her was that she moved back to the big city. Excuse me, Satan. I think you're in my seat. I'm going to start this story off by saying that this is absolutely not one of my most shining moral moments, and that I'm well aware that I was a straight up for doing what I did. My only real defense is that I was in a super bad place mentally, and needed a mountain's worth of therapy. If you're curious about the circumstances around her, check my profile. It was evil in human form. Now, on with the revenge. I was a weird kid growing up. Really weird. It was mostly because I was being abused at home and forcibly isolated. My social skills were so underdeveloped that I had difficulty reading human faces aside from my grandmother, grandfather, and father. Being the weird kid meant that I was a juicy target for bullies. It never stopped. But there was one bully that I hated more than any of the others. We'll call her Holly. This girl never passed up an opportunity to make my life hell, and since she lived across the street from me, there was nowhere I could avoid her. Holly treated me like garbage. Here are a few examples. She put dog crap in our mailbox on a regular basis. She let my dog out of my yard, and I was never able to get her back. She would also sit on her porch with her friends and roast the hell out of me to entertain them if I so much as put a toe outside of my front door. It went on for years. I hated her with the fiery passion of 1,000 suns, but while my grandmother was still alive, there was nothing I could do about Holly. If I did anything to her, or fought back in any way, my grandmother would punish me for it, and I was more afraid of her than I was of Holly, for a very good reason. So I made a plan. I suffered through all the abuse, and promised myself that when I was older, I would make Holly pay for what she did to me. Thinking of what I was going to do to her when the time was right was sometimes the only thing that kept me going. Over time, Holly grew up, and eventually she left me alone and stopped being an Unfortunately for her, by then it was too late. I didn't give a shit about her moral epiphany. I had been nursing my grudge for 2 decades, and it was time for a reckoning. I was going to destroy that. When my grandmother finally died, it was go time, and I'd had about 20 years to plan. I wasn't idle while I waited. I'd made it my mission in life to learn as much about Holly as possible, and to do it, I became friends with a few people on the periphery of her social circle. Eventually, I knew more about her and her life than even her own mother did. The first step I took in my plan was getting her fired from her job. It took longer than I would have liked, but eventually I managed it. Holly worked at a doctor's office, and I knew the doctor she worked for was super Christian. Very straight edge, upstanding type of guy. He also had a huge influence on the local community. I decided to become a patient at his office, scheduling my visits to be on the days Holly was off work. After a couple of visits, I just happened to notice Holly in the staff photo on the waiting room wall. I made a show of looking surprised and then concerned. I got to the exam room and the doctor came in shortly after. The expression on my face got his attention, and he asked me about what was wrong. I told him that even though I didn't want to, as a Christian, I couldn't keep my knowledge a secret and still sleep at night, because I just couldn't let him endanger his soul and reputation by doing nothing. I had his full attention. Then I asked him, as one fellow Christian to another, not to tell anyone where he got the information I was about to give him. After he promised he would, I told him that I knew that Holly was using illegal drugs. He was absolutely floored, and at first, he didn't believe me. I told him that I understood his skepticism entirely, but it was easy enough to prove or disprove my information with a drug test. If I was wrong, he lost nothing. If I was right, he was saving himself from trouble down the road. He finally agreed to test her, and he tested everyone else too, so it didn't look like Holly was the only target. See, I actually wasn't lying. Holly smoked a shitload of weed, and I knew that because it was my dad she used to get it from. He'd been her weed dude since she was like 15. Her test came back positive for marijuana, and much to my surprise, Xanax. Oopsie. The doctor fired Holly on the spot when the results of the urinalysis came back, and then he called me to thank me for telling him what was going on, and before he hung up, he told me that I truly walked with the Lord. Y'all will never know how hard I had to fight not to laugh at the depths of his wrongness. I thought I was going to pop a blood vessel. Phase 1, complete. I know what you're thinking. It's just a job, and it's not like she can't go get another one, right? Losing a job isn't the end of the world. You'd be wrong. Remember how I said that her boss had a very high reputation in our area? That man called every single hospital and doctor's office in the state personally to make sure that none of them would hire Holly and risk liability and loss of community trust for associating with her. Holly's field of study was all pertaining to the medical profession, so her education was rendered worthless because nobody would hire her. I wasn't done yet. Nope, not even close. She lost her job, and because she had no income, her car got repossessed. She still had her family though. 2 kids and a fiancé. Who needs families, am I right? With the help of a good friend of mine, we catfished the F out of her fiancé. My friend is hot as F. She let me use pictures of her to prove she was really real. She even got on Skype with him once. When he finally made the arrangements for a face-to-face encounter and booked a hotel room, I texted the screenshots of everything to Holly from a burner number. To say the excrement impacted the oscillating unit would be a vast understatement. They broke up. The whole thing was an ordeal, and Holly was devastated. She had 2 kids, no job, and now no fiancé who could help her keep the family afloat. A normal person would have stopped then. Unfortunately, I am not normal, and I was going full scorched earth. I seethed for 20 years. No way in hell I was going easy on her. Phase 3. With her fiancé gone and no job, Holly was struggling badly. She needed money, and she needed it quickly before she and the kids got evicted. Meth is a giant problem in my area. It's high risk, but it's also fast money, and so I started subtly mentioning Holly's situation around my more legally questionable family. Eventually, one of my family's friends, who happened to be a meth cook, got in contact with Holly and offered her a shitload of cash to let him cook dope at her house. It was supposed to be a one-time thing, 2 days and then done forever. Holly was desperate, so she said yes. Everything went smoothly at first, but dead in the middle of the cook, someone called in an anonymous tip about an active cook in progress to the local narcotics unit. They rolled up on Holly's house at about 3 a.m. and caught everyone inside, including Holly, red-handed making meth. Watching her cry as they handcuffed her and put her in that police cruiser was one of the most gloriously satisfying moments of my life. She was in deep legal doo-doo, and to make a bad situation even worse, most houses where labs are discovered aren't deemed habitable afterwards because the toxic fumes from the chemicals used to make the drug get everywhere, and it's super hard and time-consuming to clean. It's up to the property owner to either hire a hazmat team to clean it or condemn it and tear it down. A lab cleanup costs thousands of dollars. It would have cost more money to clean it than the entire property was worth, so it got torn down, with everything Holly owned still inside. See, you can't take things out of a meth lab because they're going to be covered in toxic residue. It can make you very sick, especially young children. Everything in the residence is usually counted as a loss. Now, some people sneak in and grab stuff anyway, but whatever, it's their funeral. But since Holly was still sitting in jail, there was no way for her to get anything, and none of her close family were interested in risking getting caught sneaking to the house and being accused of stealing or tampering with a crime scene. Holly ended up in jail for a while, and while she was gone, the court gave the father, the ex-fiancé, sole custody of their children, and Holly was only given supervised visitation, 2 hours every Saturday if I recall correctly. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and mine was freezing. I was behind every single bad thing that happened in Holly's life, in one way or another, for an entire 5-year period. She decided she liked bullying me and making my life hell, and she figures there would never be any consequences. Instead, I took her reputation, her job, her fiancé, got her arrested and convicted of a felony and her children taken away from her, and the best part is that she has no clue that I did it to this very day. She'd forgotten about me. What she did to me impacted my life forever, but to her, it wasn't even important enough for her to bother remembering. I was nothing to her, so she never connected me to her problems. Last I'd heard, she was in rehab for alcoholism and had her parental rights terminated permanently. After she lost her kids, she just sort of gave up and crawled into a bottle and never came out again. I was tempted to tell her, but I decided that the helplessness and confusion about why everything suddenly went to hell in a handbasket was the better plan, because that means that every now and again I can contact her and pretend to give a shit about her troubles to get a fresh revenge boner about her newest tales of woe. She thinks I'm the nicest person she's ever met. I'd say that was definitely nuclear revenge. But do you think it was a bit overkill? Do you think this person maybe went too far? Or maybe not far enough? Or was it just right? Let us know in the comment section. I destroyed my family friend's business and credibility. This story is a very long one, so I'll put a TLDR at the bottom. Also, apologies for a lack of formatting. I'm on mobile. The background. A few years after I started university, a friend of my mother's, who we will call Cook, started what can be generously called a restaurant in a small town a couple hours outside of the city we lived in. It was really a glorified hot dog stand in a golf course. My mother had invested money into this business, so she had a personal stake in ensuring its success. That meant that she would often enlist us, aka my brother and I, to waiter when she could not do it herself. And my brother hated this guy, though I don't blame him. Cook had no idea how to run a business, and he was completely uninterested in learning. He was also completely computer illiterate. He had me set up the Google account for his business, and in order to get us to work in his business, he would pick one of us up from our home, drive us 2 hours or so out of town, and we were basically stuck there until we were driven back, due to the fact that neither of us had a driver's license. And since my brother had problems with this guy, legit concerns that were brushed off as him having a bad attitude, I was the one who more often than not had to spend 2 to 10 days at a time there, stuck in a barely livable house until I was let back home. My mother was no better. She would often tell us that we would be working 2 days in the middle of a week, making job hunting a very difficult thing for my brother and I. Furthermore, she treated us not as employees, but as her children. Thus, any mistake was clearly our fault, and not because neither of them could train staff, use a computer at all, manage a business at all, utilize my brother and I in the most effective way, considering my brother had already graduated university and I was working toward a double major in business. Furthermore, they were completely unprofessional. They would host shouting matches in Chinese where the customers could hear, and the kitchen was filthy, despite Cook's insistence that the kitchen was the cleanest place in a restaurant. Yeah, right. An ice rink was less slippery than the ground in there, and he would routinely touch cooked food after handling raw meat, and I distinctly remember sweeping up what I thought was a green bell pepper, only to realize it was a moldy onion ring. Even the stove area was dripping grease. Literally, a big drop landed on my arm one time. They could not train staff at all. They had hired 5 people in the first year, and none of them came back the next. Cook, in particular, was especially two-faced in how he handled customers. He would smile at them and greet them, remembering details from previous conversations, and then turn to me and say in Chinese about how they're all stupid, stingy retirees with too much money and free time on their hands. All of this left a great feeling of resentment for both me and my brother. Not only was it effectively trapping us to work for this completely incompetent individual, we would get basically nothing out of it. This was particularly frustrating for me, because as a business student at the time, I could see all the ways the place could improve. I even offered to write up some policies, do some inventory management, and take a look at the administrative side, just to help out and get some experience for myself. They kept insisting that they didn't need it. Sure, we were paid bare minimum, and the guy did know how to cook, but we had to bear the brunt of the frustration while hiding the fact that we were sick of helping out, until we couldn't anymore. The incident. Last year, I graduated university. It was not as happy of a time as it should have been, because my grandpa passed away the week before. I couldn't even celebrate the night before I walked the stage, because I had to give part of the eulogy the previous day, and I had to mediate an incident between my brother, my mother, and Cook, because my mother couldn't. No pre-graduation shots for me, because I was stuck on the phone for 3 hours listening to how insensitive Cook was over the fact that my grandpa just passed away. But I figured that once I walked the stage and I had my diploma, I could spend the next week job hunting. No dice. Immediately after I graduated, on the Monday afterwards, my mother told me that I had to work 10 days in the Hellstraught. I lasted 6 before it happened. By all accounts, it wasn't that busy of a day to start off with. There was a breakfast brunch for Father's Day that barely anyone attended, and most people that did show up wanted to order off the menu. But both Cook and my mother were incredibly stressed out, and both of them were taking it out on me. My mother spent the day micromanaging me and finding flaws in every little thing I did, like cleaning an empty table over clearing plates from a table out on the deck, to not immediately refilling coffee or water when a glass or mug was half full, to not table touching every 5 minutes. Cook just shouted a lot and gave contradictory orders every 2 minutes, but it was the combination of my mother and Cook screaming at me for a mistake I didn't even make, something about a sauce that a customer requested but they got mad about, refusing to listen to me, literally shutting me down when I opened my mouth, and Cook mocking me for breaking down in tears. I remember him saying, "You're 25, you should know better than to cry over a stupid mistake," made me realize that not only could I not handle it anymore, but I wanted to burn the place to the ground. I booked a flight out of the province that day and left a week later. I didn't even tell my mother when or why I left. The revenge. Remember how I said that not only were they completely unprofessional, but also completely computer illiterate? See, despite the fact that I was no longer in the province, I still had all the login information for the business. Furthermore, because I knew all the laws that he blatantly refused to learn, I knew all the violations that he had committed in the business. For the first part of my revenge, I signed out his computer from the Google account. I don't think it was really necessary, since he never used that computer in the first place for anything other than porn, but I wanted to make sure that he and my mother wouldn't be able to stop me. Before I left the province, I claimed the business in review sites using the email and the business phone number. Then, I blasted every single review, positive or negative, with all the shit he used to say about customers. Any negative review was immediately mocked. Any positive review was left with a note of, "Thank you, you cheap." Any questions were met with hostility, and it basically boiled down to, "I'm right, you're wrong." I also make mentions about how he didn't wash his hands in the kitchen, and the stuff that they're yelling in Chinese are insults about uppity customers. Given that it was a tourist-based town, I'm fairly certain that that deep dip of sales that my brother mentioned later was because of all those. And no one suspected a thing, because my mother and Cook didn't know how to work the internets, and my brother didn't care enough to look up the business. Next, I meticulously documented all the complaints that I had between my brother and myself, as well as the ones from the few people Cook had hired but never kept because he could not train them. I reported the 2 times that I slipped in his kitchen, incidents where he refused to wash his hands in between handling salad and raw meat because it took too long. I also anonymously informed the tax revenue agency that he was severely underreporting income, as employees were instructed only to write down the credit, debit receipts to report in sales. I'm pretty sure this is why a lot of Chinese restaurants offer you discounts for paying in cash. If anyone knows much about the practice, leave a comment down below. The third part of my revenge wasn't really my part, to be honest. Rather, it was because of his own incompetence. As I said before, he was completely computer illiterate. I didn't even have to lock out the person he hired to do accounting because he didn't bother reporting his expenses except hand them a garbage bag full of receipts. To be honest, I felt kind of sorry for them, but because their hands were tied, they couldn't dispute any of the claims that I made. What I did do, however, was text them all the things that my mother and Cook said about them, so they wouldn't bother trying to defend his. They quit a few months before the shit hit the fan, meaning that Cook was left holding the bag. So naturally, given that the business wasn't making near as much money to pay rent, let alone pay off all the fines he'd been slapped down with, the government repossessed everything. From everything in the dinky little house that he was renting for business purposes, to every single fork and knife that he bought. Because of all the health code violations, he couldn't find a job as a cook again, which was his only job for about 30 years. And because the tax revenue agency knew how bad he was with managing businesses, they naturally denied him when he requested a permit to open up a growing operation. As far as I know, he is no longer in contact with my family, but his brother-in-law who's my mom's hairstylist, mentioned that he had to move somewhere else to get away from all the bad reputation. My mother mostly got off scot-free because all of the business permits and licenses were under his name, but she lost quite a lot of money, and last I heard, my family had to move into a smaller house. And no one knew that I was the one who was doing it. My brother suspected, as he relayed details of what had happened to me, but I never confirmed it. Not that he would tell my parents, because, honestly, that hellstraught. As for me, I'd like to say that everything's sunshine and roses, but my decision to impulsively move provinces had its ups and downs. I did manage to find a place to live and a place to work, so at least I'm alive. It's hard, but I'd rather be doing this than going back.
If you want more where that came from, simply click on one of these boxes right here. And if you liked the video, I assume you did since you're still here, share it with your friends to see what they think. And of course, if you haven't already, click the kitty to subscribe and you'll never miss another video. I'll see you in the next episode of Reddit Chronicles.